I don't know how you address distinguished ex-premiers, perhaps as distinguished speakers in this occasion. So distinguished speakers, other distinguished guests, everybody. When I got the invitation, the notice of this, I read Bartlett, Greiner, and I thought, you know, this would be an interesting seminar. And then I read a bit further and my own name was there. So we have a good group now collaborating. We're not all members of the Whitlam Institute, although we're not hostile to it. In fact, we're collaborating with it. We have a very close collaboration. But it's certainly an honour to be asked to speak. In a sense, what I'll try and do is perhaps extend a little bit the sort of scope of things in order to draw some of the enormous experience that we have, have on our panel. Perhaps significance of education. Again, Adam Smith used to say, the great political philosopher, the difference between the philosopher himself and the porter who carried his bags was education. And I was just thinking, and I don't know either of the two distinguished ex-premiers well, but I was thinking the difference between what they are now and if they didn't have education. I mean, education clearly in both of their cases, I guess perhaps more dramatically in David's case, is quite stark, and that's probably true of all of us. But if one thinks of Tasmania, it just seems to me that the future of Tasmania has to be in high education, the quality end of things. And it is rather special to have somebody who's a Premier and Education Minister. That's an unusual mix in Australia. And I think that in a sense shows us something, that in fact often education ministers come and go and so on, and it doesn't have the priority it should have. Context. So what I'm going to say is policy is really important, and political opportunity, and some remarks on that. But clearly background is also very important. Although in one sense it doesn't matter if you look at people who have got there. But I remember Sir Anthony Mason, when he'd retired from the High Court, and at the launching of the handsome volume, the Oxford Companion to the High Court, to which I'd contributed and so had he, and they had a very formal launch by the then Chief Justice, Gleeson, and one of the comments he made, and he got onto education, was that none of the members of the Gleeson court, and it was a very distinguished court, its parents had gone to university. And I thought that was very surprising. And I said to Anthony Mason, because I said, I found that very surprising. He said, well, yes, he did too, but he said, and it tells, doesn't it? Anyway, so my point though is not so much that, in fact it's that politics and policy is really important here. And I'll just make a few comments organised around a few points, hopefully that this might fill out and draw in our speakers a little bit more broadly. I guess the first point, and Nick Greiner's already made it, that why is education reform so hard? Well, I've sort of thought, well, it's because there's not a clear public perception that is necessary, that there's not an obvious problem or issue there that's to be remedied. Sort of public sentiment, public opinion is perhaps not there. And the other thing, and this is a very interesting sort of a dynamic relationship, public opinion and leadership. Sometimes when public opinion is not there, say as in the Republic, strong leadership can talk it up. Or if you take another example, which Nick Greiner was involved in, if some things are hard, federal reform is hard, surely. And leading the federal reform in the early 80s came not just from Canberra, and not primarily or initially from Canberra, it came from the states, including leaders like Greiner. And so leadership and this sense of urgency or public opinion are important. If you look through any sort of list of public policy issues, carbon trading, the Murray-Darling, it took the drought to sort of galvanise a real sense of crisis there. Tariff reduction, the Republic, some things don't go anywhere, sometimes they do. So I think that's one, that sort of linkage between a sort of the public sentiment that this is necessary and the leadership to somehow either capitalise on that or even to form it and lead it. The second reason why education reform is so hard is the federal one, because we have a federal system. If you have multiple governments, state governments, and an increasingly intrusive Commonwealth government for good reasons, then you have a very complex and a very difficult political policy area. And of course this is true of most of our major policy areas. And it's not just in that that complicated system, but then you have this very long established, deeply entrenched system in each of the states. And you only have to walk around here, and I arrived a bit early this morning because I hadn't read my program carefully. I thought we were starting earlier than we did. I had time to walk around the education building, which I'd never noticed before. But it's a huge building. I mean, it symbolises the significance and the centrality, the stability of education in this city and in this state for a long, long time. So very entrenched. But then, and I'll come back to this a little bit more, the federal system allows alternative modes, and two of the main ones might go to cooperation. You can do things through cooperation. You can do good things or bad things through cooperation. Cooperation of thieves or of colluding state premiers who don't, want to sort of take the Commonwealth down the wrong track or something. But then competition. Competition can be good and bad. And a federal system will allow you to have either or both, or mixes of the two, for good or bad. And so again, it does require a high level of management, intergovernmental leadership to work this and work it properly. I think there's been a tendency, and in a sense, we're now at a period of change. I'm no expert in New South Wales, but I understand there's probably going to be a change of government on the weekend. This will be a new era almost, with now Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, Queensland, Anna Bligh might save it there. But public policy for the next at least half decade, and usually longer, depending on how well these new governments turn out, it's often a 10-year span now, is going to be very much not through a central sort of frame and perspective, but much more through a decentralised and back to the state thing. And so if there's going to be reform, it's going to be, in a sense, through there. It's not going to come through probably the weakest government we've ever had, or we've had for a long time in Canberra. So the third obvious point, and it's come in very ways already, the third reason why the reform is hard, and I think this was one of Nick Greiner's key things, is that we have a multiplex sector that's government, state, independent. John Power, a distinguished ex-professor at Melbourne, likes words, and he is talking about the Republic. He's got these words, I don't think he quite made them up, but they sound as if he did. Bicephalus and cephalus, a single cephalus. It sounds like a tropical disease, but apparently it's not. It just means one head of state or two. Well, we have a sort of a tricephalus system. And again, that makes it very difficult to change, particularly when it gets entrenched. And one of the fascinating things I think about thinking of federalism and schooling is that we have that sort of system partly because we have a federal system, that the state system managed the government school sector, and increasing with the pressure from the Catholics, the federal government came in to fund those. And that's basically still, with variations, the sort of recipe we have. And that makes it very difficult to put the two systems together when they're basically funded in different ways, particularly if the Commonwealth is not going to have some overreaching power, which seems probably more likely to be the case. So just, in a sense, to complement those, then I thought, well, that might seem it's all a bit hard, but how would you think about reforming? Well, if you go back, and I've already, I guess, given some of the indications, that each of those things they're complex, but they're susceptible to change. Sort of this public perception, public culture leadership can change, and there has to be the right opportunity, the window opportunity perhaps of having particular sorts of state premiers and a national leadership coinciding, and they don't always, and they perhaps don't usually, but they do at times. And as I say, one or other might be the lead. Public opinion might be the lead, or leadership might be the solution. Federalism, as I've mentioned already, does allow you enormous complexity, but there are aspects of cooperation, competition. States can lead, you can have innovation or not. And so there's a lot of possibility there. And even in this tricephalous, if you want to call it that, it's a terrible word, I know, arrangement that we have, again, there's a certain diversity and flexibility potentially there. One of my worst thoughts, having lived in Canberra for 11 years, although it's a very nice place in Canberra, educationally, the Research School of Social Sciences, a university with no students, at the research end of it is a very pleasant place to be. Not forever, it gets a bit boring, but it was for 11 years. But being in Canberra, one of your worst fears is that Canberra ruled, you know, everything in Australia. People that don't live in Canberra and haven't seem to think that might be a good idea. So you have in this, you know, many sort of stranded system, I think you have a certain diversity and perhaps the possibility which would allow you to say that, well, education is perhaps not as hard as we might think. Thank you.